Joining us now on the Picks for Polls podcast, he is the go-to guy for Penn State football. He covers the Nittany Lions for 247 Sports, writing for Lions 247. Daniel Gallen's in the house. He's been on the show before when we talked about Chop Robinson with our publisher, Zach Pearson. This time, though, he's back breaking down everything Penn State going into 2024, looking ahead to the 2025 draft. You can check him out on Twitter at Daniel JT Gallen. How's it going? Thanks so much for hopping on here.
Yeah, I'm doing great. I really appreciate being back with the Bear Report and our 247 family. It's always fun to get to talk to some different audiences.
It definitely is. I mean, there is a lot going on here, I feel like, because the Bears have kind of seen Penn State as this, pipeline for NFL talent. You look at them selecting Jaquan Brisker 3 years ago with the 48th overall pick in Ryan Pohl's first draft. But just kind of getting into it here. I mean, you talked about covering Jaquan before we started recording. Prior to us recording, you talked about, covering Jaquan for a year. What was he like? What were your interactions like with him? Because I think, when we do this podcast and we talk about Jaquan Brisker, there's a lot of really good things to say.
Yeah, I think the one thing that stood out to me with watching him on the field is that he's kind of the definition of a gamer. That's not to take anything away from his raw talent, because he is an incredibly talented defensive back. But he was playing through injury that whole last year, but it never really looked. You could tell he never really let it affect him, or he never wanted to show that it was affecting him. He'd go down, a couple times, have to come out for a play, but he would be right back in there. And I think that kind of speaks to who Jaquan is as a person and how he approaches things as a player. I think in terms of interacting with him off the field and in media sessions, he was just very, very about his business. He always struck me as very serious. I think knowing his background and kind of the journey that he took to get to where he is now, that he kind of knew what he needed to do. And I think that's how he kind of approached everything with, in the back of his mind that he wanted to take advantage of this opportunity. He wanted to get to that next level. And I think that really showed in, how he talked to us, how he played on the field, just kind of how he went about his business at Penn State. And even now with the safeties room, they still talk about Brisker as someone that they look up to, that's someone that really set the tone. You've got guys like Jalen Reed and Zachy Wheatley, who were freshmen in 2021, Brisker's last year, and they still talk about him and the influence that he had. So, I think that he's someone who has kind of had that long tail, I guess, of influence after they've moved on, which I think is something in terms of legacy at a place that's a big positive.
It definitely is. And, you talk about just getting to know Jaquan as a person. It's interesting, because me coaching high school football here in Illinois, there's a lot of different clinics I go to. And Mark Dupuis, who I believe is an offensive analyst, he's back at Penn State, who's the assistant wide receivers coach before. So we were in a clinic one day and I just went up to him and I'm like, hey, what are, or I told him, I cover the Bears too. And so we kind of got into this nice little conversation about Jaquan Brisker. And Mark always told me, he's like, yeah, with Jaquan, it was a lot of fun being able to hang around him as a person, but also just getting a chance to really, trash talk him, because he kind of trash talks in a playful way. And I will say a lot of that and a lot of what you said kind of just translate over to who he is as a Chicago Bear. But getting into it, the Big Ten's a conference where there's tons of changes, right? Like, you look at the SEC, you've got Texas and Oklahoma joining this year. That's pretty much it. The Big Ten, though, you're factoring in, a couple programs on the West Coast, Washington, UCLA, USC, which, again, we'll get into those later. But what's the vibe around University Park going into the 2024 season? Because, Penn State sent 8 guys to the draft last year. This year, though, I think there's a chance that they send a lot more, and a lot of it is some star power from the offensive side of the ball, too.
Yeah, I think that there's coming into this year that it's kind of, I don't want to say make or break type season, because Penn State has been successful for so long, back-to-back 10-win seasons. James Franklin has, a bunch of New Year's Six Bowls on his resume. He's been very successful over the past decade, but I think that people have gotten maybe a little tired of seeing that 2 in the loss column after every regular season and having those 2 losses be Ohio State and Michigan. And so I think that coming into this year, people want to see Penn State take that next step. I think that in terms of the conference changing, you don't have Ohio State and Michigan on the schedule this year. You just have Ohio State. It's at home. You get Washington, UCLA, and USC as the newcomers to the schedule, so you don't have to worry about Oregon. And USC, UCLA, and Washington are all kind of in their own places, making their own transitions, especially Washington and UCLA with new coaches. And so I think that things are set up. People want to see Penn State into the playoff. I think that everyone feels like they have the talent to do it. This junior class, the class of 2022, is very, very talented. These guys aren't kids anymore. Suddenly they're the veterans. And so I think that there's, really high expectations for what Penn State can do this year. But, there's a ton of questions. You've got 3 new coordinators. People want to see the offense take a step forward. People want to see Drew Aller take a step forward. People want to see this wide receiver core produce. And so, there's a lot of questions that we have going into the season, but overall, a ton of excitement, I think, in State College. The recruiting trail has been a little up and down recently. So I think people are kind of ready for the games to start to get into the regular season. And there's high expectations, which, it's always the case at a place like Penn State.
It's going to be interesting to watch here because, when a lot of people think Penn State quarterbacks, I mean, Sean Clifford's obviously the name that comes to mind. It seems like it's been forever since Penn State's had like a surefire top talent at that position. But Drew Aller's a guy who has been drawing comparisons to Josh Allen, guys somewhat like Cam Newton too, in the sense that people see all the physical tools there. They see the size standing there at 6'5". They certainly see, I think, a lot of the arm talent, the physical traits, the intangibles just needed to play that quarterback position. And you look at last year, when he was a full-time starter, I mean, he was up and down. He had his inconsistencies, but I think a TD to interception ratio of 25-2 isn't necessarily all that bad, considering he wasn't necessarily the only issue. But what does Drew have to do to kind of take a step forward and allow everything to materialize? Because again, right now he is a guy that's being projected to be a top 10 pick sitting here in July.
Yeah, I think with Aller, the one thing, just kind of from I guess a more surface level perspective that people want to see is they want to see how he does in Penn State's biggest games of the year. Against Ohio State and Michigan last year, those were 2 of his worst games of the season, and they ended up being losses. They were both pretty close games, where if Penn State can just get something going on offense, maybe things look a lot differently. Of course, Ohio State and Michigan, 2 of the better defenses that Penn State played last year. So I think that that's what people want to see, is that they want to see Aller kind of come through, make those big plays, I guess be clutch, however you want to measure that. I think from kind of that's the more like surface level, maybe esoteric part of things. But I think the big thing with Aller is, how he's going to fit in this new offensive scheme under Andy Kotelnicki, who had a really, really successful run at Kansas with Lance Leipold, going back to Buffalo and Wisconsin Whitewater too. So, Kotelnicki, there's a lot of excitement about him. 24 Sports named him their coordinator of the year last year. He runs an exciting system. If anyone watched Kansas over the past couple of years, really creative. And so people want to see how Aller fits into that, how he can be maximized. And people want to see him throw the ball downfield. I think that was one of the things that really stood out last year. There were plenty of issues with the wide receiver core, injuries, inconsistency, lack of development for younger guys. But we never really saw Aller take those shots downfield. Who knows if he was being handcuffed a little bit by Mike Yurcich, by James Franklin. I think that one of the lines of thought is that he was really concerned with not making mistakes. And so that led to things being a little bit more conservative. That also leads to the nice touchdown to interception ratio. But if you watch some of the games, there's not a lot of downfield shots. A lot of kind of yards after the catch on occasion. But Penn State's offense last year felt really kind of station to station. kind of working its way downfield. So I think with Aller, people want to see him open it up a little bit. We know he's got that arm talent. Let's see him use it.
Yeah, and you talk about not necessarily having a incredibly explosive offense. I think part of that was just because when people look at Penn State, when people look at the wide receiver room, I mean, we kind of have to keep in mind, right, that this was a school that did send a lot of high-end wide receiver talent, namely guys like Allen Robinson, guys like Jahan Dotson to the league, but they haven't necessarily had, some of those top receivers come through like others would anticipate. But hopefully that changes, because you look at Penn State right now. I mean, the receiver room to me is interesting. You got Julian Fleming there. You have Harrison Wallace III coming in. And all of a sudden, you start to look at those two guys and you say, okay, there is a lot of potential here. And keep in mind, I believe Harrison Wallace III just transferred in from Ohio State. So he is
Fleming. Fleming came in from Ohio State. Wallace is in his 4th year with the program.
Yeah, so it's Fleming was the one that I was trying to remember as I was putting this thing together last night. But, there's, I think, a lot of high-end talent there, and people are looking at those guys and saying, okay, breakout season potentially on the horizon.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think Wallace is the guy that people are kind of looking for that breakout season from. I think Fleming, he's a former 5-star recruit. I think he was the number 3 overall player in the class of 2020. Went to Ohio State. We know the reputation there. But he battled some injuries. Obviously, when you're in a room with that much talent, you can get surpassed by guys like a Marvin Harrison Jr. But Fleming coming in, we've heard a lot of good things about the intangibles that he's bringing, leadership to the room. Showing how things showing how things were done at a place like Ohio State, and that's had an influence on some of the younger players in the room. Well regarded for his blocking. But I think that when you're talking about the on-field splash plays, Harrison Wallace III is the guy that you want to keep an eye on. The way that Penn State's coaches and his teammates have been talking about him for the past year is that they've been talking about him like wide receiver 1. Even with Keandre Lambert-Smith around last year, Wallace was the guy that there was the most excitement about. But he got hurt last year. Wasn't helped by some of the inconsistencies in the offense. And so the end total product wasn't the most, eye-catching thing. But he's a former basketball star in high school down in Alabama. You could say he's a freaky athlete. He's fast. I think that there's a lot of high hopes for what he can do this year. I think that if you look at this wide receiver group, he's one of the guys that could be a real breakout star, really put himself on the radar both nationally and at the next level.
Yeah, and those two guys are going to be fun to watch because you ultimately look at the way that Penn State kind of coaches their wide receivers, the way they train them. I mean, these are not just guys, who can do one or two things and all of a sudden, explode off the line of scrimmage. Like they're guys who, their receiver moves, I think watching them from a coach's perspective are incredibly layered in the sense that you have that initial release, but then you also go ahead and you have, a second or third level move like a rocker step that may go ahead and be used. And then there's a whole bunch of other different release packages that I know are taught there just watching Mark Dupuis' presentation in terms of, hey, on this specific play, if you have this type of route, this is what you should go ahead and do. So it's a lot of really interesting stuff. But sticking here with the offense, you got Theo Johnson's now in the league playing for the New York Giants. Theo Johnson was, I'm not even going to lie to you, one of the major draft crushes I had for the Bears that if I was a scout in the room at Hallis Hall, I would have pounded the table for a million times over because he did break a lot of those combine records for the tight end. Now it's Tyler Warren's turn to step up. Now, Tyler Warren, to me, you talk about a guy that is big, he's lanky, he's physical. He certainly fits what NFL teams are looking for in a modern-day tight end. I watch him, and I kind of think Pat Freiermuth from a few years ago all over again. But Warren, I believe, had 30-something receptions in 2024. Is this his tight end room? Is it time for him to go ahead and shine now?
Yeah, definitely. I think that it is a talented room behind him. Andrew Rapplier is a redshirt freshman. We think he can break into the rotation this year. Khalil Dinkins is a redshirt junior. He's done some nice things over the past couple of years. And then Luke Reynolds is a freshman. He was a 5-star number one tight end in the 24/7 sports rankings. He's put on more than 30 pounds since he got to campus in January, and I think he's put himself in a position where he can see the field. I don't know if he'll burn his red shirt, but he's someone that I think we're going to see. But I think that it all starts with Warren at the top, and I don't think that any of the guys behind him will really push into that. Over the past couple of years, Penn State has had a lot of tight ends come through and go into the league. In 2021 and 2022, you had Brenton Strange, Theo Johnson, Tyler Warren, all on the field sometimes in 13 personnel, all of them playing major roles. In the last year, you have Theo Johnson and Tyler Warren, splitting time, and that is a very physically imposing, a very talented tight end duo. This year there isn't kind of that 1B to go with Tyler Warren's 1A, at least not yet. Maybe Dinkins or Rapplier can become that over the course of the season, but going into it, Warren is the guy, which Penn State hasn't really had at tight end in the past couple of years. So, I think we could see Warren's numbers take a jump. Aller, I think, has really good chemistry with him. And Warren is he's one of those guys where he's a former basketball player. He was originally committed to Virginia Tech as a quarterback in the class of 2020, I believe. And so he has a unique background, unique athleticism, and he's just a really dangerous weapon in the red zone. I mean, I think it's 7 touchdown catches last year, and kind of talking to him once last season after a practice, I was kind of like, this is a really dumb question, but why are you so good in the red zone? And he said that it's how he uses his body. He's a massive guy, and he kind of knows the different leverages, knows where to be, knows how to present a big target, to the quarterback. And that's something that Penn State really took advantage of. I think that tight ends, depending on who you are in the NFL, everyone values them a little bit differently. But I think that he's someone that coming into next year, you could say that he's a potential day 2 pick. I said the same thing about Theo Johnson going into last year. I mean, he was one of my favorites to watch last year. He was someone that I always felt Penn State could have used a little bit more. And he lasted till day 3. That's just kind of, I think, how things work with tight ends. But I think Warren going into next year is going to have a ton of buzz around him in the draft.
I mean, he is going to be a player to go ahead and watch. I think, there's a lot of talent on this Penn State offense, but it's like you kind of mentioned earlier, there's also a lot of questions. And with the first-year offensive coordinator, I mean, let's keep in mind it's an incredibly long season. So for guys like Drew Aller, guys like Tyler Warren, Fleming and Harrison Wallace as well, there's a lot of intriguing questions to answer. But I think one thing that shouldn't be a question for Penn State is going to be that running back room, because the Big Ten obviously has a lot of really good running back duos. It's fair to argue that in terms of talent, productivity, and bringing kind of the two styles of running back to the table, you got a guy who can go ground and pound, you got a guy who gets out into space and is all of a sudden a speedster, sort of like a human joystick. Nick Singleton and Creighton Allen are both going to be players that are draft eligible. And it is, a tale of two complete opposites here, because you have Singleton, who had, a bit of a down year in 23, dealing with some, injuries, a lot of stuff that never really kept him on the field. But his 2022 season, year 1, was absolutely phenomenal. And then you have Allen, who wants to take a step forward. What are some similarities and also differences between both of these guys that are going to allow the Lions to kind of have that 1-2 punch that should hopefully also open things up for Drew Aller?
Yeah, it's a really fun running back room, and both of these guys, Katron Allen and Nick Singleton, have produced since day 1 back in 2022 as true freshmen. I think that you start with Singleton. He told us last month that in spring testing he ran the 40 in 4.33, so he can get out there and run. And you pair that with his strength. He's one of these guys that comes into college and has a really extensive strength training background. from when he was in high school in the Reading, Pennsylvania area. We were allowed into the weight room every, at the end of winter workouts, and watching him squat, watching him just kind of go through everything that you have to do in the weight room as a college athlete is really, really impressive. I think pound for pound, he might be one of the strongest players on the team, and he pairs that with that speed. It's really impressive. I think that last year it was not his best year. At times, it felt like that he was maybe thinking a little bit too much. But you would see it every once in a while when he would get to the edge or just hit the hole and just go. Is really, really impressive. Katron Allen has had a really, really interesting career, at Penn State. His nickname is Fat Man. He came in and was listed at 225 pounds when he got to campus. During his freshman year, he was all the way down to 201. And at the same time, he was still that interior, strong, powerful runner. He's not afraid to lower his shoulder and run over you. And now he's back up into the 220s. So Penn State managed to transform his body while he was playing. He didn't need the red shirt, didn't need to take a year off, basically, to do that like some guys do. And he was still able to produce while he was going through all of that too. I think that Allen is a really complete back. It's an interesting dynamic because both of these guys. Singleton was a 5-star. Allen was in the top 24/7. But Singleton was the in-state guy. He was the Gatorade Pennsylvania Player of the Year, Gatorade National Player of the Year. Everyone kind of knew him in Pennsylvania. Allen was kind of he's from Virginia, went to school at IMG in Florida. People didn't have a lot of exposure to him. And so, I think that Allen is kind of regarded as like the star by, I think, a lot of people, but, it really is a 1A and 1B. It is a timeshare. They also know that it's good for the team and also good for themselves so that they get to the NFL and they have a lot of tread left on their tires. But, they play off of each other really well. Singleton has learned from Allen in terms of patience and kind of watching how Allen does things and, waiting for the holes to open and then being able to hit them. I think that Allen, looks at Singleton and that's kind of, they go against each other athletically, competitively. I think that it has just made a really, complementary room, two guys that really play off of each other well and can do some really good things on the field.
And both of those guys should be super fortunate that they were running behind a really good offensive line last year. I mean, when you have studs such as Olu Fashanu, Hunter Norzad, and Caden Wallace, all three of whom just got drafted, you are going to be licking your chops as a running back. But you talk about the offensive line. You've got Sam Wormley, who is back this year. You also have Sal Wormley's his name. You also have a couple questions as to who's going to step up, who's going to fill in. I mean, who exactly is Wormley as a player? Because he brings a lot of experience to the table where he's going to have, 30-something starts, I believe, by the time the season's said and done, pushing 40, honestly.
Yeah, Wormley is an interesting case. He missed the 2021 season because of injury. He was in line to be the starter at right guard that year. Penn State had to shuffle things around, and they really struggled that year. It was a very up and down year for the line. A lot of question marks about it, but Wormley came back healthy, got the starting job in 2022, and kept that through last season. And it is interesting the way that Penn State does things on the offensive line is they're really not afraid to rotate. If they think that you deserve to play, you will play. And so, we've seen it before. Early last season, Caden Wallace and Drew Shelton were rotating at right tackle, but then Wallace really solidified himself there. At left guard last year, Venga Ioane and JB Nelson were rotating for much of the season. And that was just kind of that they both deserved to play. They were both good enough. And so that's how Penn State, approaches things. Like, I wouldn't be surprised if they have rotations at a couple different positions this year, just because the way that they've recruited, the amount of talent that they've stockpiled on the line is that they've got guys that can play. So I'm interested to see what it means for Wormley, because at left guard, JB Nelson and Venga Ioane are both back this year. So I'm curious to see how that shakes out. Venga Ioane got more playing time last year because Nelson got banged up. But at right guard, it was just Sal Wormley the whole time. But Cooper Cousins has come in. He's a freshman and one of the best players in Pennsylvania. Definitely a high floor prospect. Like, he looks the part as of someone who can play in the Big Ten right now, and he's just a freshman. He got a lot of work at right guard. He's probably the center of the future. I don't necessarily think that a freshman can, or I don't. It's going to be tough for a freshman to be a starting center, and I don't think that you'll see. I don't think you would rotate at center. Nick Dawkins, a redshirt senior, kind of has, for now. We're penciling him at that spot, but Cooper Cousins got a lot of run at right guard in the spring. Sal Wormley didn't play in the spring game, so we saw a lot of Cousins there. And Cousins is the type of guy that you can't keep. You're not going to be able to keep him off the field. So I'm interested to see if that means that we see more of a rotation there at right guard. But, Wormley's got a lot of experience, plays with an edge, has a sense of humor, kind of a classic offensive lineman, and kind of some of the conversations that you can have with him. And I'm really interested to see what this year means for him and what it could mean for his NFL future moving forward.
Yeah, I mean, it is kind of really intriguing because I feel like the way that things are going in the league, a lot of teams do value those super versatile but also really experienced offensive linemen, because then at that point it's kind of just hey, if you can play 2 to 3 positions on the O-line, it's really just a plug and play, especially for a guy that does play in the interior. But switching over to the defensive side of the ball here, I mean, Abdul Carter's switching from linebacker to defensive end this offseason. A lot of, the top media outlets like The Athletic have him ranked as a possible top 10 pick. I mean, I think that if you are an NFL coach and scout, you see a guy that's 6'3", 250, you are honestly licking your chops because you're getting a player that's big, long, strong, is really lengthy, maybe a pass rusher for the first time, but has shown that he's been able to be pretty productive. And then you look opposite him. I mean, you have Dennis-Sutton, all right, who's 6'5", 270. He had 3.5 sacks last season. So really, I think the sky's the limit for both of these guys when it comes to their ability to take that next step forward. And the opportunity is right there in front of them because Chop Robinson's now gone. Adisa Isaac is now gone as well. Both of those guys are in the league hoping to make massive impacts.
Yeah, I mean, it's kind of crazy when you think about Penn State had its top 2 defensive ends drafted last year in the first and third rounds, and you don't really expect them to miss much of a beat because of who Abdul Carter and Dennis-Sutton are and what they've accomplished already. I think Carter is probably a guy that a lot of people would be tuning in to this podcast to hear about and learn about, just because he's picked up so much buzz this offseason with his move. It was really interesting. We found out about it over the winter. Going into spring ball, it really felt like James Franklin was, trying to temper the expectations a little bit, saying that this is a completely new position to him. A lot more goes into it than just saying, hey, line up, put your hand in the dirt, rush the quarterback. But by the time we got to the spring game in April, after 5 weeks, James Franklin was like, yeah, this went better than we, could have thought. Talking to his teammates, they all said like, yeah, it's legit. I was talking to Dennis-Sutton after a practice, and Dennis-Sutton was just like, oh yeah, like Abdul was killing guys today. Talking to some of the veterans on the line, they said Abdul Carter is a sponge. So he's definitely, I think, married the physical aspect of the game and the mental aspect, of the position switch. And I think that he's the type of talent that, isn't going to, fall short, of what he wants to do. I think that he's someone who is wired in that certain way, and, is really, really going after what he wants. So I'm really excited to see, what he can do this year, how Tom Allen uses him. If they get creative, he is putting on a little bit more mass. He's up around 260 pounds now, from where he was at 250 last year. Deion Barnes, the defensive line coach, said that, you haven't noticed a difference in the athleticism, that he's still the same kind of electric athlete that he was when he was, 10 to 15 pounds lighter, playing at the second level. So, I think that people really think that the sky is the limit for what Abdul Carter can do. Dennis-Sutton is, a little bit of a, still a lot of excitement around him. He's a former 5-star recruit. He picked Penn State over Alabama and Georgia in the class of 2022. He's kind of been in that number 3, number 4 role, for much of his career, and now he's going to get that chance to, step up, and be that top pass rusher. I think that it wouldn't be a surprise to, see him listed in the first round of some mock drafts just because of his pedigree, what he can do, and physically, he feels taller than 6'5". Like, one of my coworkers is 6'3" or 6'4". He's convinced Dennis-Sutton is 6'7". And then, at 270 pounds, he does not look like a 270-pound man. He just carries everything on his frame so well. And I think that he is poised to do some really, really good things this year. I'm really excited to see what he can do in kind of a full-time role. Penn State is still going to rotate because that's what you have to do, at that pass rusher spot, keep everyone fresh. But Dennis-Sutton, I think, could be, by the time we get to December, everyone loves Abdul Carter. There's still a lot of excitement about Abdul Carter, but a bunch of people are saying, oh, like, deny Dennis-Sutton. Like, yeah, that's a first rounder.
Absolutely. I mean, those are going to be some names to watch. Switching over to the secondary here, I mean, I'd like to say that Penn State's got some really good safeties. Obviously, we do see Jalen Reed being kind of that versatile Swiss Army knife getting a lot of the attention, but I think it's fair to say we shouldn't sleep on KJ Winston either in terms of who he is as a player and everything that he brings to the table. But two really good safeties over there at Penn State right now.
Yeah, the safety position I'm really excited for this year. Jalen Reed has just kind of been a really steady performer back there. Excuse me. He burned his red shirt in 2021, playing behind Jaquan Brisker and Jair Brown. In 2022, Penn State pretty much did a 4 safety rotation with Jair Brown, Keaton Ellis, Zachy Wheatley, and Jalen Reed. And then this past year, it really kind of narrowed down even more to basically Jalen Reed and KJ Winston, as the safeties. And so, I think that with Reed, he's regarded as for the mental side of the game. He's considered a great processor, and he's going to have a little bit different of a role around under Tom Allen. Penn State, had Manny Diaz for the past 2 years, which was pretty much a straight up 4-3. But Tom Allen runs a little bit more of a 4-2-5, and they're going to play a lot of 3 safety sets on early downs. And Jalen Reed is going to be the lion position, which is going to be that hybrid nickel safety linebacker playing up closer to the line. I think that fits him well. He's a really physical player. Still has some ball hawk skills as well. But I think that, putting him up near the line of scrimmage, he's going to be able to do a lot of different things for Penn State. He's a team captain material. He's going to be at the Big Ten Media Days next week, and Penn State is super selective about who they take to that type of thing. They only take you if you're an academic senior, and then some other criteria in there as well. So for him to be to get that nod, I think speaks to his standing in the locker room and who he is. But now going over to KJ Winston, I think KJ Winston has seen his stock rise the most this offseason without any games happening, without anything going on really. He missed some time in spring because of an injury, but I think as people have kind of gone back and spent the offseason looking at last year and trying to project things forward, he's someone who has really, really gotten a lot of attention. I know he graded out really well in PFF, all those different sorts of things. But, he is another one of those kind of like team captain material guys, just really cerebral, great locker room presence, kind of, knows what needs to be said, really thoughtful. And then you pair that on the field with what he's able to do. He's long, he can hit hard, he can cover some ground. I'm really excited to see what he can do this year as, kind of a full-time player. I thought it really said something about the way that he and Reed really locked down those safety spots last year that, like I said, in the offensive side, Penn State loves to rotate. If they think you deserve to play, you're going to play. They're going to figure it out. But for those two to kind of lock it down, I think spoke to the progress that they made over the course of last season, and projecting how things look moving forward.
Absolutely. And, those are two guys, knowing the way that the league's just gone in terms of, teams seemingly wanting to invest more and more in the secondary, especially with just how hybrid defenses have become. That line position is going to be one to really go ahead and watch, because a lot of teams do in the modern league run the 4-2-5 as a base defense. But last one for me here, we talked earlier about Penn State and all the new additions to the Big Ten. I mean, you obviously have that annual Ohio State game. You have the matchup against Wisconsin, but there is a stretch where, you're going to have UCLA, USC, Wisconsin, Ohio State, and Washington all on the schedule. I mean, outside of the Buckeyes matchup, which is the most intriguing game for you on the entire schedule looking at 2024?
I think in terms of novelty, it's the USC game. Going to the Coliseum, something new, something different. Going. I love fall and State College, but spending some time in LA in October, sounds really nice. So I think from the novelty perspective, that one stands out to me. But I do think that Wisconsin game is really interesting to me, and I think could be a little bit more of a pivot point in the schedule. I'm really intrigued by what the Badgers have done these past couple of years, and how they've really revamped themselves as a program. It's going to be a road game in Madison, which can be a tough place to play sometimes. Penn State will be coming off a bye, but it is 2 straight road games. Traveling cross country to USC, having a week off, and then having to go to Madison, which isn't exactly the shortest trip. I think that's a really, really interesting dynamic. And then on top of that, you have Ohio State kind of looming, the next week. So, I think that stretch from UCLA through Washington, that can really determine how the season goes for Penn State. I do think that if they get through that with only one loss, I think they're in a really, really good position to make the college football playoff. I think if they get through that with only one loss, they're probably in the mix for the Big Ten, for a berth in the Big Ten championship game too. So I'm just really intrigued by that stretch. I think that's going to be fun because you got the new teams. You have UCLA, USC, and Washington. You have a fun road trip in going to Wisconsin, and then you have the biggest home game of the year against Ohio State. So from that perspective, it's going to be awesome, awesome month of football. But at the same time, for Penn State, really crucial for how they make their way through that. Getting through that, unscathed or with only one blemish, I think is really big for them. But it's just going to be fun. I think when you look at that, I think that's a really good part of their schedule to highlight right now, as we're looking towards the fall.
I mean, it is going to be intriguing. And honestly, I'll say this, kind of living in Big Ten country, you go and you look at all the matchups and all that. And all I'm going to say is that with the addition of these West Coast teams, it is going to create for some really intriguing Big Ten football, because you have, 4 big programs joining the conference. And then you already have programs that have a lot of tradition and history, like Wisconsin, Michigan, Penn State, Ohio State, obviously. And then there's those programs like Illinois, for example, that are seemingly trying to make some noise and on the come up, but we'll kind of see how all that goes, which I believe the Lions play the Fighting Illini this year, but I don't know if it's a home game or a road game. But
the Big Ten opener at home at the end of September.
Oh, yeah,
and it could be the whiteout, given how things are going.
Exactly. It's going to be fun to watch. Before we get out of here, where can people kind of follow you on social media and keep up with your work?
Definitely. You can follow me on Twitter at Daniel JT Gallen. I'm on Facebook. I'm on Instagram. Instagram is by Daniel JT Gallen. If you put in any combination of Daniel JT Gallen, put by in front of it, sometimes you'll be able to find me. That's pretty standard across the internet. And then you can read my work at lions247.com. Myself, Tyler Calvaruso, Mark Brennan, Tyler Donahue. We've got 4 full-timers, working on that Tyler C does a great job covering recruiting. Tyler D and I do a ton, of kind of team coverage and podcasting. I think that it's one of the best places to get some of the most well-rounded Penn State coverage on the web. And with Big Ten Media Days next week, the season kind of is unofficially underway. So we're ramping up our coverage, putting together some different fun features to kind of preview the season, and we're really looking forward to what should be a big year for Penn State.
Absolutely. It's going to be fun to watch. Thanks so much for hopping on here. We'll have to have you back again some point during the season to debrief, all the good stuff that's happening over in University Park.
Yeah, definitely. We'll see how, I think you said Penn State had 8 guys drafted last year. I'll be curious to see once we get to December who we're talking about as the picks for this year. Should be a lot of fun.